Okay, today I'm going to talk about arguments. This is mainly from chapter 2. So I want to go over some of the basic distinctions again between inductive and deductive arguments. In deductive arguments, uh, the conclusion, what you claim in a deductive argument is that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So what you're looking for in a deductive argument is a claim that you can know with 100% certainty. In an inductive argument, the best you're ever going to get is probability. So let me go over a little again about how to diagram an argument. And then I want to explain something about an argument called an enthymeme. Enthymeme. E-N-T-H-Y-M-E. I want to talk about enthymemes, and also during this little lecture, I want to talk about induction, deduction, and what's called abduction. Okay? So, first of all, let me explain what an enthymeme is. Many arguments, in fact, most arguments that people make are enthymemes. And what does that mean? An enthymeme is an argument that is missing a premise, that there is either a premise or sometimes a conclusion. And the reason why the premise is often missing is because it's so obvious what it is that you don't want to waste your time saying it. In fact, most of the arguments you make during the daytime with your friends are enthymemes. Let me give you an example of an enthymeme. Take a very simple argument. The conclusion is going to be statement 1, you should study. And the reason why you should study, let me make this better. The reason why you should study, the premise will be 2, you have a test tomorrow. Okay. Now many people have said that to their friends. You should study tonight. You shouldn't go to the party. You should study because you have a test tomorrow. Okay, now that's an argument. And it's a deductive argument because what the person is trying to say is that you should really study because there's a test tomorrow. You should study. It's not a matter of probably. You really should study. It's a logical consequence of this. But if you think about it, there's something missing here. It says you should study. I left this out. You should study because there's a test tomorrow. There's something missing. What if your friend said, "Oh, that doesn't follow. I mean, you should say I should study, and the reason is there's a test tomorrow. What's the connection?" And so, you say, what's the connection? Now, it's obvious what the connection is, but let's say your friend says, I don't understand the argument. What's the connection? So then you'll say, okay, I'll tell you the connection. I left a premise out. So let's call it the missing premise. We're going to add a premise. We'll call it 2A because this is premise 2. So the A you can think of as standing for assumption. Something is being assumed. So your friend will say to you, okay, my argument was really you should study because you have a test tomorrow. And the missing premise would be if you don't study, you won't pass the test. So let's put that in there. If you don't study, you won't pass. I'll just say won't pass. Okay, now we have a deductive argument because we now have two premises that lead down to a conclusion, and the two premises logically imply the conclusion. You have a test tomorrow. If you don't study, you won't pass. Therefore, you should study. Okay, that's a deductive argument. At least it makes sense as a deductive argument. But let's say at this point, your friend still says, well, that's still not a good argument. You say, really? It's not a good argument. And it really, logically, there's something missing here. Because we're going to actually have to add another premise. I'll put it on this side over here. So we're going to have to add a premise 2b. Because the reason this doesn't logically follow from these two premises, you might say it does follow. There's a test tomorrow. If you don't study, you won't pass the test. Therefore, you should study. That seems to follow. But, it really doesn't. Because what you're assuming is that your friend wants to pass the test. What if your friend says to you, oh, I don't want to pass the test. I want to flunk the test. I don't care whether I pass or not. Well, if your friend doesn't care whether they pass or not, then there's no point why they should study. So what we're assuming is that your friend wants to pass the test. So we're going to have to add another premise. You want to pass the test. Okay, now we have a foolproof argument, a logical argument, a deductive argument. These three premises actually do imply the conclusion. They lead down to the conclusion necessarily. This follows from these three premises with 100% certainty. If it's in fact the case that you have a test tomorrow, you want to pass the test, and if you don't study, you won't pass the test, it does follow that you should study. Okay? So the initial argument was you should pass the test because there's a test tomorrow. That's the type of arguments we normally make in everyday life. But if you want to really be rigorous and to show that you understand the logic of the argument, you've got to supply the missing premises. So basically, the lesson here is that when you encounter an argument and you want to analyze that argument and see if it really is a valid argument, if it's a good argument, you've got to do some work. You've got to supply the missing premises. Okay, now, let me give you another example. I'll give you an example of when you have an argument that has missing premises. As I mentioned before, it's called an enthymeme. So let me explain why it's called an enthymeme. Etymologically, from the Greek, enthymeme means in the mind. So what's happening in an argument where you're missing a premise, where you're leaving a premise out, you have an enthymeme because you're not stating the premise. You're not stating some premise or more than one premise. You're keeping it in your mind. And the reason you're not stating it is because you think it's obvious. And if you did state it, your friend would probably think you're crazy. I mean, if you went to one of your friends and said, you should study tomorrow because there's a test, and then you added to that, you should study tomorrow because there's a test. You want to pass the test. And if you don't pass the test, you won't study. Your friend would say, why are you saying all that stuff, right? You think you're crazy. Okay, so let me give you an example of an enthymeme in which there's not only a missing premise, but a missing conclusion. So I'm going to give you an argument that just has one statement, but it's going to be a complete argument. Okay, imagine the situation. You have to imagine the context. Imagine a mother is ready to say goodbye to her daughter. She's going off to first grade. It's raining outside. I mean, the mother and the daughter, they're looking out the window, right? And it's pouring down rain. And the mother says to the daughter, she just makes one statement. She makes an if-then statement, a conditional statement. She says, if it's raining outside, if it's pouring outside, you should take an umbrella. Okay, that's all she says to the daughter. We'll call that statement 1. Now, that's not an argument. It's a conditional statement. But in the context in which the mother spoke that sentence, it's an argument, it's an enthymeme. And the daughter, let's say she's 6 years old, 5 years old, she has never read anything about arguments. She doesn't know what an enthymeme means. She's never heard the word, but she will be able to reconstruct an argument out of that one statement. The mother says they're looking outside and they say it's pouring. The mother just makes one statement. If it's pouring outside, you should take an umbrella. What the first thing the daughter will do is add another premise to this. She'll add premise 2. So I'll call it 1A. She'll add another, well, I'll just call it premise 2. She'll add another premise to it. And what the premise is, it is raining. It is pouring. Okay, now the little girl has added that premise. The mother never said it. She just said, if it's pouring outside, you should take an umbrella. She doesn't have to say it's pouring outside because they're looking out the window. They could see it's pouring. So the mother doesn't have to waste her time. She doesn't say to the daughter, if it's pouring outside, you should take an umbrella, and it is pouring. She doesn't say that because they're looking outside together and they see it's pouring outside. The mother says, if it's pouring outside, you should take an umbrella, and that's all she says. The daughter fills in a premise, it's pouring outside, and then she'll fill in the conclusion. She puts the two premises together. If it's pouring outside, you should take an umbrella. It's pouring outside. The obvious conclusion is you should take an umbrella, or she should take an umbrella. You should take an umbrella. You referring to her. You should, or I should, because she's thinking that way. You should take an umbrella. Take an umbrella. This is a good example of an argument, of an enthymeme, which is an argument that is missing a premise and a conclusion. And the person who is analyzing this argument is a 5-year-old girl who's never heard the word premise, who's never heard the word conclusion, who's never heard the word enthymeme. And she solves it. I imagine trying to program a computer to do that. It would be almost impossible. I don't know if they could do that, because you'd have to provide all this context to the computer. The little girl can do it. She does it immediately, instantaneously. She does it. I don't know how she does it, but she does it. All little kids could do that. So that's an example of an enthymeme. And if you should think of some things you say during the day, arguments that you make with your friends. Just think of some that you'll see that many of them are enthymemes, probably most. So that's an enthymeme. I can't remember if your book talks about enthymemes or not. It probably does, but it does talk about filling missing premises in. And when you fill a missing premise in or a missing conclusion, that's what you're doing. You're dealing with an enthymeme. Okay, so I think that's about all I'll say today, because I'll in another video, the next video I do on argumentation, I'm going to talk about eventually I'm going to get into diagramming. I think the next video I'll talk about the difference between induction, deduction, and what's called abduction. And I'll give you a very interesting example. One example that you can kind of play around with the sentences. It'd be 3 sentences, 1, 2, 3, and you could put them in different orders. 1, 2, 3, 1, 3, 2, 2, 3, 1, and you'll get different types of arguments. You'll get induction, abduction, and deduction. I'll do that in the next video. Okay, so that's all for today. Keep reading. Read carefully, read slowly, take some notes. Make sure you understand the stuff. Okay, thank you.